My friends, do you remember how in the past few years, there were many articles about a possible Chinese invasion of Australia? Too easy, mate! At the time, all these headlines seemed like fiction. Well, China just bullied Australia on their home turf. On the 21st of February 2025, a flotilla from the Chinese Navy initiated live-fire exercises only 640 kilometers east of Sydney, without prior notification to Australian authorities. The Australian government wasn't even aware of this, until a commercial pilot flying over the area warned them. And if that wasn't bad enough, the Australian Defence Force came close to losing its entire navy. The New York Times reported, Chinese warships circle Australia and leave it feeling near naked. No spoilers, but that's because this small Chinese task force could have completely outmatched Australia's entire fleet. After all these fireworks, the big booms, these live fire exercises, the Chinese warships simply continued their journey around Australia, as if they were racing for the Tour de l'Australie. But in the process, the Chinese warships also sailed by all of Australia's critical military infrastructure, which they completed by the 10th of March. So in this video, we will analyze how Chinese warships even ended up near Australia, what happened with these live fire exercises, and how the Australian Defence Force came extremely close from a complete military disaster. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Indo-Pacific region. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you for everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. So let's start by talking about why Chinese warships even headed towards Australia. I mean, apart from Australian fitness babes, what could they be looking for? The story starts with the People's Liberation Army Navy flotilla composed of 3 vessels, known as Task Force 107, departing from the Yulin Naval Base and transiting through the South China Sea between January and February 2025. On the 3rd of February, the flotilla entered the Solo Sea from the Mindoro Strait, then exited through the Basilan Strait on the same day, with an average pace of around 18 knots, or the equivalent of 33 kilometers per hour for us Earthlings. Coincidentally, the USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group was trailing behind at a slower pace, averaging at 11 knots. The American Strike Group entered the Sulu Sea through the Balabac Strait on the 5th, and then exited through the Basilan Strait on the 6th. After exiting the Basilan Strait, the PLAN flotilla diverged and formed a pincer around Papua New Guinea, with a destroyer and naval replenishment ship sailing to the north and a frigate to the south. The Australian Defence Force started surveilling these Chinese vessels the moment they sailed towards Australian waters. While all this was going on, a first incident happened between Australia and China. On the 11th of February, near the Chinese-claimed Parcel Islands, a J-16 intercepted an Australian P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft and released flares 30 meters in front of the Royal Australian Air Force aircraft. Actually, a similar incident happened in May 2024, when a Chinese J-10 fighter aircraft dropped flares 300 meters in front of a Royal Australian Navy MH-60R Seahawk helicopter over the Yellow Sea. So as you can see, there was already some beef between the two nations. But all these incidents happened relatively close to China. So that's why the PLAN's Task Force 107 converged in the Coral Sea on the 13th of February, and by the 19th reached the closest point to the east of Sydney. Clearly not a threat to the Australian Navy, right? Right?
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm!
What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm! Wait! Everybody calm down!
Like we said earlier, the PLAN's task force was composed of 3 vessels. So there was the Type 55 cruiser Tsunyi, equipped with 112 vertical launch system cells capable of firing anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and surface-to-air missiles, with ranges over 1,500 kilometers for the CJ-10 cruise missiles, and beyond 500 kilometers for the YJ-18A anti-ship missiles. The Tsunyi provided the task force with advanced air defense, long-range strike capability, and the powerful Type 346B gallium nitride AESA radars for situational awareness. The second one was the Type 54A frigate Hengyang, a versatile escort ship equipped with 32 VLS cells, that can fire HQ-16 surface-to-air missiles with a range of approximately 74 kilometers. In addition to that, the frigate is also equipped with YJ-83 anti-ship cruise missiles with an operational range of 250 kilometers, plus various anti-submarine weaponry. As you can imagine, the Hengyang was designed for fleet defense and anti-submarine warfare. It also serves as the task force shield against aerial and underwater threats. Its compact size allowing it to operate effectively in complex littoral environments. Interestingly, this frigate is believed to have operated a large unidentified aircraft near Papua New Guinea, as it was spotted 6 kilometers inland by local villagers. The question is, what was this aircraft? The Type 54A has a flight deck and a hangar at the stern that can deploy a single medium-sized helicopter, such as the Harbin Z-9C. This is the most plausible explanation. Others believe this unidentified aircraft was actually a drone. If true, this theory opens a can of worms about the PLAN's operational capabilities of drones from their frigates. The third vessel of this task force was the Type 903 replenishment ship Wei Shenhu, a vital logistics vessel that can carry 11,000 tons of supplies. The Wei Shenhu greatly extended the operational range of the task force, allowing for sustained deployments far from home waters. At last, analysts speculated that there was maybe a fourth vessel as part of this task force. You guessed it, a submarine, which for obvious reasons was not visible. That's kind of the purpose of the submarine, yeah. Anyway, due to the distance traveled and the absence of port calls, it is believed that if there was a submarine, it must have been a nuclear-powered one. The theory of a fourth vessel, part of Task Force 107, is very plausible. For example, the PLN already deployed a Type 93 nuclear-powered submarine all the way to the Indian Ocean, an event which made the Indian defense community extremely uncomfortable. That's how on the morning of the 21st of February at 9:30 a.m., the flotilla began its live-fire exercise. According to The Guardian, the following timeline described the events of the day. 0958, Air Services Australia receives notification of the live-fire drill from a Virgin Airlines pilot, who heard the broadcast from the PLAN's warships on an emergency radio channel. 1000, air traffic controller issue a hazard alert. They establish an 18-kilometer exclusion zone around the flotilla, extending to a height of 45,000 feet. 1008, Air Services Australia notifies the Australian Defence Forces Joint Operations Command Headquarters about the drill. 1101, the New Zealand Navy, which had been shadowing the Chinese flotilla, informs Australia of the live-fire exercise. 1400, exercise ends according to radio transmissions from the flotilla. Unlike what the PLAN does around Taiwan, this time they didn't use missiles. So yeah, they still wanted to provoke Australia, but within reason. And the worst is that all this was legal according to international law. These live-fire exercises took place in international waters. We also have documented evidence that during this live-fire exercise, the Tsunyi fired her 130mm main gun. It might look small on the video, but I mean, look at the size of that thing in real life. The cannon is so big that she couldn't help but hug it and put her face on it. Additionally, because of footage that was made public, we know the Hengyang frigate fired its Type 730 CIWS 30mm air defense guns. The limited footage released showed all guns firing at very low elevation, presumably simulating surface and low altitude aerial targets. The New Zealand frigate Te Kaha was shadowing the Chinese task force. The New Zealanders also saw how the Chinese warships positioned some sort of target far into the water and then fired on it as part of this fire exercise. And once they were done, they had the decency to recuperate their target and bring it back on board. Obviously, the commander of the Te Kaha also intercepted the radio call made by the Chinese warships and immediately relayed the information back to Australian authorities. The rugby teams of the All Blacks and the Wallabies might have one of the biggest rivalries in sports history. In times of wars, they're back to being best mates. Now, just to troll the Australians, the Chinese task force repeated the exercise in the Tasman Sea the next day, from 0930 to 1400. During this time, a Boeing P-8 Poseidon aircraft from the Royal New Zealand Air Force continued to monitor the task group's activities. And at least this time around, there wasn't a Chinese aircraft ready to throw its flares right into the face. The exact details of the exercise are still unknown, but it is clear that any missile launchers would have been picked up by both the Australian and New Zealand's militaries. Promptly after the live fire exercises, the Chinese fleet navigated towards New Zealand, then southwest to loop around the southern coast of Australia. This is the furthest south the Australian east coast Chinese warships have ever ventured. And to celebrate this achievement, the Chinese warships trolled the Australians once again by sailing in and out of Australia's exclusive economic zone. By the 2nd of March, the PLAN's task force entered the third week of its journey around Australia. On the 4th, they sailed 170 nautical miles from Perth. By March 6th, the flotilla had already passed the northwestern Cape of Australia, and in the end the Australian Defence Force stopped monitoring the Chinese vessels after the 9th of March. And that's how China hit a home run around Australia.
Fuck you!
What's important to understand is that although this was the first live fire exercise near Australia, this is not the first time the PLAN ventured in the South Pacific. Back in October 2024, two Chinese destroyers, a Type 55 and a Type 52DL, visited Vanuatu. It is not a rare occurrence, as warships of different foreign countries routinely visit the island nation to dock and resupply on long voyages. PLAN auxiliary support ships like hospital ships and diplomatic teams also regularly visit Pacific island nations, especially for disaster relief missions. For example, that's how China delivered supplies and sent specialists to aid Vanuatu after the nation was struck by an earthquake back in December 2024. An action which in itself can be seen as a jab at Australian influence in this region. However, what brought the Chinese Navy to the gates of Sydney and its unique PAWG specimens could be geopolitically considered as a payback. You see, on the 25th of September 2024, a task force sailed through the Taiwan Strait. As you can imagine, it's always very sensitive for Beijing when that happens, since this means potentially hostile warships are located less than 100 kilometers away from the coast of China. This task force was composed of a Japanese Takanami-class destroyer, the JS Sazanami, an Australian Hobart-class destroyer, the HMAS Sydney, and a naval replenishment ship from New Zealand, the HMNZS Aotearoa, a derivation of the Royal Navy's Tide-class tanker. Very strange. Does it ring a bell? The Chinese task force that sailed around Australia was the exact mirror to the one that sailed through the Taiwan Strait. This means China responded to the provocation with a naval group of the same tonnage and composition to send a clear signal to its Australian and New Zealander friends. Where it gets complicated is that the maneuver through the Taiwan Strait was in itself a response, since it was made right after China executed a successful test launch of the DF-31AG ICBM into the Eastern Pacific. Japanese government officials also confirmed that the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force made the first solo trip through Taiwan Strait in February 2025, after making the first accompanied trip through the strait in September. As you can see, it's a never-ending cycle of responses to previous actions. What we can conclude is that China's gunboat diplomacy can also be seen as part of a greater strategy to expand its influence in the Indo-Pacific and Southern Pacific regions, while testing the response of the Australians, the New Zealanders, and its allies. By doing so, China is also aiming to secure vital trade routes with its key ASEAN partners. What was scary for the Australian Royal Navy is how the small Chinese flotilla could have turned all the Australian warships into attacks right off. The Royal Australian Navy possesses 3 Hobart-class destroyers, each with 48 VLS cells, and 8 Anzac-class frigates, each with 8 VLS cells, for a total of 208 VLS cells for 11 warships. In comparison, the 112 cells of the Type 55 destroyer and the 32 cells on the Type 54 frigate add up to 144 cells. These 2 Chinese warships matched 70% of the firepower of the surface vessels of the Royal Australian Navy. Given that the Australian warships are dispersed around the country and not all of them are operational at any given time, the 2 PLAN warships could have been able to match or even establish a local superiority against the Royal Australian Navy's surface warship fleet. Obviously, if the Chinese flotilla faced the entire Australian Navy, at the same time, it would not stand a chance. However, we can't forget that with 40,000 tons, the total tonnage of this Task Force 107 is only 2% of the PLAN's total tonnage. This means China has 50 times more vessels available. With the rapid expansion of the PLAN, Australia and New Zealand should anticipate more frequent visits from Chinese warships in the months and years ahead. What if next time around, China doubles the size of the task force? Then China could have 288 VLSLs versus 208 for Australia. Even if you add New Zealand's 2 Anzac-class frigates, the ratio of forces would be 288 for China versus 224 VLSLs for Australia and New Zealand. And all this at what cost? 4% of the Chinese Navy? It's nothing. Do you realize how crazy that is? 4% of the entire tonnage of the Chinese Navy could force Australia and New Zealand into submission. Given the proximity of the PLAN flotilla to the Australian coast, what's scary is that not only were they lurking on Australian beach babes, but in theory the PLAN fleet had enough reach to launch strikes against critical military infrastructure located all along the coast. For example, in mid-February, the Chinese task force sailed past Amberley Air Base, west of Brisbane. The air base is used by B-2 stealth bomber task forces in the Indo-Pacific direction, as well as FA-18F Super Hornets and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. On the 19th of February, the flotilla arrived east of Sydney. 130 kilometers to the north of Sydney lies the RAAF base Williamtown, which is the primary base for the Australian F-35A stealth fighters, along with the E-7A AWACS aircrafts. Within Sydney is the HMAS Kitable Naval Base, which is a major hub for the Royal Australian Navy surface combatants and amphibious assault ships. The flotilla also made a prompt visit near the coast of Adelaide on the 28th. They could have visited Willie OAM and said, "Ni hao ma," but north of Adelaide you can also find the RAAF base Edinburgh, which hosts number 92 Wings P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol and anti-submarine warfare aircraft, the same air wing that constantly shows up in the South China Sea to exercise its freedom of navigation. On the 4th of March, the flotilla sailed by Perth. Off the coast of Perth is Garden Island, where the HMAS Stirling Naval Base is situated. According to the Australian Defence Ministers, a base home for Australia's first nuclear-powered submarines, which at this point they may or may not get. Australia currently possesses 6 Collins-class diesel-electric attack submarines, but they are considered to be outdated by many analysts. These submarines are only comparable, if not inferior, to the Chinese Type 39 diesel-electric submarine, which numbers at 35 units, and is the most numerous submarine type in the PLAN's inventory. You remember that in 2021, Australia broke the deal with France and opted for the AUKUS nuclear submarine instead. Sounds good on paper. In reality, this pushed the enter of service of the first hull from the early 2030s to the late 2030s. And overall, they laid the Royal Australian Navy's effort to increase its capabilities by 15 years. Even worse, with the tensions regarding the use of US-made military equipment. This entire submarine plan might just fall apart, and Australia and its Navy might once again be fully exposed. In that case, they quickly have to think of a plan B. The Guardian wrote, "Could the promised AUKUS nuclear submarines simply never be handed over to Australia?" So Australia might have to look somewhere else for its submarines, but that's the topic for another video. As part of this tour de l'Australie, the Chinese flotilla also passed the northwestern Cape of Australia, further away from the coast on the 6th of March. This is where the Harold E. Holt communication station is located. It is claimed to be the most powerful transmission station in the southern hemisphere and provides radio signal communications to US, Australian and other allied ships and submarines in the western Pacific Ocean as well as in the eastern Indian Ocean. As you can see, all these installations came within range of the Chinese warships. Had they been targeted, destroyed or damaged, the Australian military, and especially its navy, would have been crippled into submission. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.